They set up the single dad as a joke on a blind date with a deaf girl. His actions left them in tears. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The corporate break room of Morrison Marketing buzzed with the familiar tension of another Friday afternoon. Ryan Matthews stood frozen at the coffee machine, his hand trembling slightly as he held the printed email that had just shattered his world. The promotion he'd been chasing for 3 years, the senior marketing director position that would finally solve his crushing financial problems, was going to someone else. Someone who'd been at the company for barely 18 months. "You okay, man?" Mike Chen appeared beside him, noting Ryan's pale complexion and the paper crumpled in his fist. Ryan's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "James Wilson just got recommended for the senior director position." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Mike's eyebrows shot up. "The new guy. But you've been here since before he even knew this company existed." Ryan finished bitterly. He glanced around the break room, making sure they were alone before continuing. 3 years, Mike. 3 years of 60-hour weeks of covering for incompetent managers, of staying late while everyone else went home to their families. And for what? The unfairness of it all crashed over him like a wave. His mother's medical bills were drowning him. The second mortgage on his house was 3 months behind. He'd been counting on this promotion, had already mentally allocated the salary increase to keeping his family afloat. "There has to be a mistake," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No mistake." Ryan said, his tone growing sharper. Golden boy James Wilson, with his perfect performance reviews and his innovative team-building approach and his bleeding heart inclusion initiatives. The man can do no wrong, apparently. Brad Rodriguez wandered over, drawn by the tension in Ryan's voice. "What's got you looking like someone stole your lunch money?" "Worse," Mike explained. "The promotion went to Wilson." Brad's face darkened. "You're kidding me. The guy who's been here, what, 1.5 years, the one who acts like he's running for office with all that nice guy routine?" "That's exactly what it is," Ryan said, his anger crystallizing into something colder, more focused. A routine. An act. Nobody's that genuinely nice, especially not in this industry. He's playing everyone, and somehow it's working. The 3 men stood in silence for a moment, each processing their shared resentment. Ryan had always suspected James's kindness was performative, but watching him get rewarded for it while Ryan's hard work went unnoticed felt like a personal betrayal by the universe itself. "You know what really gets me?" Ryan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's going to be my boss. James Wilson, the man who holds doors open with a smile that's just a little too perfect, who remembers everyone's birthdays, who stays late to help junior employees with their presentations. It's all calculated." Mike shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, maybe he really is just—" "Nobody's that nice," Ryan interrupted. "Trust me. Everyone has a breaking point where the mask slips. Everyone has a situation where they show their true colors." Brad leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Ryan's mind was racing now, fueled by desperation and 3 years of accumulated resentment. "I'm thinking it's time to find out who James Wilson really is when the cameras aren't rolling." "The cameras aren't rolling now," Mike pointed out. "Metaphorically," Ryan said with growing excitement. "Though actually that gives me an idea." Over the next 20 minutes, as the break room gradually emptied and the weekend crowd headed for the exits, Ryan outlined his plan. James was divorced, had been for years, no wait widowed. Even better. The grieving single father act was part of his appeal. Janet from accounting mentioned last week that she's always trying to set her friend up on dates. Ryan said, "Some woman who's had a string of bad luck. What if we arranged a blind date for our perfect golden boy?" "That's not exactly exposing him as a fraud," Brad said skeptically. It is if we choose the right woman, Ryan replied, his smile turning predatory. Janet's friend is deaf. Completely deaf. Car accident a few years back. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Mike looked uncomfortable. Ryan, that's pretty harsh even for proving a point. Is it? Ryan's voice was rising with righteous indignation. The man built his entire reputation on inclusion and caring about people with disabilities. He gives presentations about workplace accessibility, for crying out loud. But when it actually inconveniences him, when he's stuck on a date he can't easily escape, that's when we'll see the real James Wilson. You really think he'll bail on a deaf woman? Brad asked. I think James Wilson has never been in a situation where his fake kindness was actually tested, Ryan said with absolute certainty. And I think when push comes to shove, he'll show his true colors. We just need to make sure we capture it. The plan took shape with disturbing efficiency. Janet would innocently suggest the setup to James, mentioning only that her friend Sarah was blonde 30-something and could use a nice evening out. The disability wouldn't be mentioned. Let him discover that surprise in person. Riverside Bistro. Ryan decided. Friday night next week. We'll get a corner table, set up phones to record. The moment he realizes what he's walked into, the moment he makes his excuses and leaves her sitting there, boom. We've got him. And then what Mike asked, though, he was clearly warming to the idea despite his earlier reservations. Anonymous post to the company career forum, Ryan said. Video evidence of the real James Wilson abandoning a disabled woman on a date. Let's see how the executives feel about promoting someone capable of that level of cruelty. As they finalized the details, Ryan felt something that had been missing for months: hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of a drowning man, but the cold satisfaction of someone who was about to prove he'd been right all along. What he didn't notice, couldn't have noticed, were the small details that might have given him pause. The way James unconsciously moved his hands when he was nervous, fingers forming shapes that looked almost like gestures. The framed photo on James's desk that showed not just his daughter, but a woman in the background whose hands were frozen mid-conversation in what looked suspiciously like sign language. The pieces of a story Ryan had never bothered to learn. Saturday morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains of the modest two-story colonial that James Wilson called home. The house bore the unmistakable marks of a single father doing his best artwork held to the refrigerator with mismatched magnets. A basket of unfolded laundry on the kitchen counter and the lingering smell of slightly burnt pancakes from breakfast, attempts that never quite matched the perfect circles Catherine used to make. James stood at the stove, spatula in hand, watching 7-year-old Emma bounce in her chair with the infectious energy that only comes from being young enough to believe Saturday mornings were made of pure magic. Daddy, you're making funny shapes again, Emma announced, her curly brown hair catching the morning sun as she tilted her head to watch him flip pancakes. The dinosaur one looks more like a blob monster. Abstract art, James defended, sliding the misshapen pancake onto her plate. Very sophisticated, the kind that sells for millions in fancy galleries. Then we should sell them and buy a swimming pool, Emma declared with the logical reasoning of childhood. James laughed, the sound echoing through the kitchen that had been too quiet for too many years. 5 years since Catherine's sudden death, and he still sometimes caught himself listening for her voice calling from upstairs, still set the table for 3 before remembering, still reached for his phone to text her about Emma's latest adorable declaration. The grief had settled into something manageable, now less like drowning and more like carrying a heavy backpack that never quite came off. But watching Emma's gap-toothed grin as she drowned her pancakes in syrup, James felt something that had been missing for a long time, contentment that wasn't tinged with guilt. "Emma, eat your breakfast before it becomes soup," he said, settling into the chair across from her. The kitchen table was small, intimate, perfect for a family of 2 who'd learned to make their own traditions. Daddy, Emma said around a mouthful of pancake, Why don't you ever do fun stuff anymore? The question hit him harder than it should have. What do you mean, bug? We do fun stuff. We went to the zoo last weekend and we have movie nights every Friday. I mean, fun stuff without me. Emma clarified with the brutal honesty that children wielded like weapons. Like dates. Sarah's mum goes on dates. She gets all dressed up and puts on perfume and comes back all giggly. James nearly choked on his coffee. Emma, where is this coming from? School. She shrugged as if that explained everything. Everyone talks about their parents. Tommy has a stepmom who makes really good cookies. Maya's dad has a girlfriend who taught her how to braid her hair. I told them my daddy doesn't date anyone because he's still sad about Mommy, but Mrs. Patterson said, maybe you're not sad anymore, maybe you're just scared. Mrs. Patterson was their elderly neighbor who watched Emma. When James had to work late, a woman with the unsettling ability to see through every defense he'd carefully constructed. And what do you think James asked carefully, not sure he was ready for her answer? Emma considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. I think Mommy would want you to be happy. And I think you'd be happier if you had someone to talk to when I'm at Sarah's house for sleepovers. The wisdom in her words caught him off guard. When had his 7-year-old become so perceptive about his emotional state? Would that be okay with you? He asked. If I did start dating again, would she be nice to me? Anyone I dated would have to be nice to you, or I wouldn't date them. James said firmly. You're the most important person in my life, Emma. That will never change. Emma beamed. Then yes. But she has to like Disney movies and she can't try to make me eat vegetables I don't like. I'll add that to my list of requirements, James promised. That afternoon, as Emma played in their small backyard, while James attempted to repair a loose board on their deck, his phone buzzed with a text from Janet in accounting. They'd struck up a friendship over shared coffee breaks and conversations about the challenges of office politics. Hey James, random question. Any interest in a blind date? My friend Sarah could use a nice evening out, and you're literally the nicest guy I know. No pressure, but I think you two would hit it off. Let me know. James stared at the message for a long moment. When was the last time he'd been on a date before Catherine got sick? Which meant it had been over 6 years. The thought terrified him. But Emma's words echoed in his mind. Maybe you're not sad anymore. Maybe you're just scared. He was scared. Terrified, actually. Not just of betraying Catherine's memory, but of opening himself up to loss again, of bringing someone into Emma's life who might leave, of being responsible for another person's happiness when he was still figuring out his own. But he was also lonely in a way he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Lonely for adult conversation that didn't revolve around work or Emma's school schedule. Lonely for someone to share the small moments with. The funny things Emma said, or the pride he felt watching her grow into such a remarkable little person. Daddy, you're making your worried face again. Emma called from the sandbox Catherine had built the summer before she died. James realized he'd been unconsciously moving his hands, fingers forming the signs for nervous and confused that his mother had taught him decades ago. Old habits died hard, especially when stress brought back muscle memory from childhood. Just thinking bug. About dating Emma's intuition was becoming scary, maybe. Emma abandoned her sandcastle and ran over, climbing onto his lap with the easy affection that was one of parenting's greatest gifts. Daddy, do you remember what you tell me when I'm scared to try something new? That brave doesn't mean you're not scared. James recited the words he'd told her before her first day of school, her first sleepover, her first time riding a bike. It means you do it anyway, because something good might happen. Exactly, Emma said with satisfaction. So be brave, Daddy. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed elephant Catherine had given her for her 2nd birthday, James sat in his living room surrounded by photos of their life together. Catherine at their wedding, glowing with happiness. Catherine pregnant, her hand resting on her growing belly. Catherine holding newborn Emma, both of them looking exhausted but blissful. He pulled out his phone and typed a response to Janet. "I'd like that. Thank you for thinking of me." The message sent before he could second-guess himself. Catherine's photo smiled at him from the mantel, and for the first time in 5 years, James didn't feel guilty for taking a step toward the future she would never share. Instead, he felt something that might have been her approval, her gentle push toward the happiness she'd always wanted for him. Emma had been right. Catherine would want him to be happy. Now he just had to be brave enough to try. Sunday afternoon found James and Emma in their favorite spot. The living room floor surrounded by the chaos of a 1,000-piece puzzle featuring dinosaurs that Emma had insisted they tackle together. James was beginning to suspect that his daughter's confidence in their puzzle-solving abilities far exceeded their actual skill level. "Daddy, this piece has a foot on it, but I can't find the dinosaur it belongs to," Emma announced, holding up a fragment that could have belonged to any number of prehistoric creatures. "Maybe it's a mystery dinosaur," James suggested, searching through the scattered pieces for anything that resembled a body. "A new species that only has 1 foot." Emma giggled at the absurdity. "Dinosaurs need 2 feet to walk, Daddy. Or 4, but not 1. "You're absolutely right," James conceded, marveling, as he always did, at the logic that children brought to bear on the world around them. "We'll keep looking for its match." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of peaceful companionship that James treasured. These were the moments he'd been afraid of losing. When Catherine died, the simple joy of being present with his daughter, of watching her mind work through problems, of sharing the small discoveries that made up childhood. "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, her voice taking on the careful tone that usually preceded important questions. At school on Friday, Mrs. Henderson announced the father-daughter dance for next month. James's hand stilled over the puzzle pieces. "That sounds fun, Bug. Would you like to go?" "Yes, but—" Emma trailed off, arranging puzzle pieces into neat piles by color. All the other girls were talking about helping their dads pick out ties to match their dresses and asking their mums what shoes to wear and planning their hair. The unspoken longing in her voice made James's chest tighten. "We can figure out all of that together, Emma. I may not be an expert on fancy hair, but YouTube has tutorials for everything." Emma smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know you'd try, Daddy. You always try. But sometimes—" She paused, clearly struggling with how to express something that felt too big for her 7-year-old vocabulary. "Sometimes, what, sweetheart? Sometimes I wish I had a mom too, not instead of you, but as well as you. Like a complete family." The words rushed out in a torrent, as if she'd been holding them back for months. "I love you so much, Daddy, and I know you love me. But there are things that feel like they're missing." James felt his heart crack open. He'd known this day would come, had dreaded it, but somehow he still wasn't prepared for the raw honesty of her longing. "What kind of things?" he asked, gently. Emma's hands moved restlessly among the puzzle pieces. "Like having someone to braid my hair who actually knows how to make it look pretty instead of just keeping it out of my face. Or having someone to ask about girl stuff when I get older. Or having someone to help plan your birthday parties because you always forget until the day before." That last point hit particularly close to home, since James had indeed forgotten his own birthday last year, until Emma reminded him. And Emma continued, her voice growing smaller, "Having someone else who loves you the way you love me. Because sometimes you look really lonely, Daddy, especially at night when you think I'm asleep. But I'm really just lying in bed thinking." The perceptiveness of children was sometimes devastating. James had thought he'd been hiding his loneliness well, but apparently 7-year-old Emma saw more than he'd realized. "You know what I think about when I'm lying in bed thinking?" she asked. What bug I think about how Mommy would want us to be happy. Really, really happy. Not just okay, or fine, or getting by, but happy like we were when she was here. Emma's voice took on the earnest quality that always appeared when she was working through complex emotions. And I think maybe we can't be that happy with just the two of us anymore. The simple truth of it nearly brought James to tears. He pulled Emma into his lap, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering sweetness of the cookies they'd made earlier. Emma, I want you to know that you are enough, he said firmly. You're more than enough. You're everything. But you're also right that families can grow and change, and that doesn't make the love smaller, it makes it bigger. Like how your heart doesn't get smaller when you love more people, it gets bigger to fit them all. Emma said, clearly repeating something she'd heard before. Exactly like that. Where did you hear that Mrs. Patterson told me when I asked her if you still loved Mommy, even though she's in heaven? She said love isn't like pie, where there's only so much to go around. She said love is like a campfire, it just gets bigger when you add more wood to it. Mrs. Patterson's wisdom struck again. James made a mental note to bring their neighbor some flowers as a thank you for helping Emma navigate questions he hadn't even realized she was asking. So Emma said with the decisive tone that usually preceded announcements that would change their entire weekend plans. I think you should go on that date with Janet's friend. James blinked. How do you know about that? I heard you talking to Janet on the phone yesterday. You use your nervous voice when you're scared, but trying to be brave. Emma settled more comfortably in his lap. And you were moving your hands the way you do when you're really thinking hard about something. James had never realized how much Emma observed about his unconscious habits. The hand movements were something left over from childhood, when his mother had communicated primarily through sign language, and he'd learned to think in gestures as much as words. What do you think about me going on this date? He asked. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a diplomatic summit. I think you should wear your blue shirt because it makes your eyes look nice, and you should brush your hair so it doesn't stick up in the back. And you should tell her about me right away so she knows I'm part of the deal. Any other advice? Be yourself, Daddy. You're pretty great when you're just being you. Emma paused. And maybe don't tell any of your really bad jokes until at least the second date. You have to ease people into those. James burst out laughing. My jokes aren't that bad. Daddy, yesterday you asked me why the math book was sad, and when I said I didn't know, you said because it had too many problems. That's a really bad joke. That's a classic, James protested, but he was grinning. Emma giggled and hugged him tight. I love you, Daddy. Even your bad jokes. And I think someone else could love them too if you give them a chance. That night, as James tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with Catherine's eyes and said, Daddy, tomorrow when you call Janet back, tell her yes. Tell her you'll go on the date. You're sure about this, Bug? I'm sure, Emma said with absolute confidence. Sometimes the best things happen when you're brave enough to say yes to something new. As James turned off her light and headed to his own room, he realized his daughter had somehow become the wisest person he knew. Tomorrow he would call Janet. Tomorrow he would take the first step toward something that terrified and excited him in equal measure. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, he fell asleep thinking about the future instead of the past. Sarah Mitchell's apartment was a study in contrasts. The morning light streaming through her west-facing windows illuminated a space that was simultaneously the sanctuary of someone who'd learned to find beauty in solitude and the careful construction of a life rebuilt from fragments. Her living room bore no traces of the music that had once defined her existence. No piano, no guitar propped in the corner, no scattered sheet music covering every surface. Instead, her design workspace dominated the room. 3 monitors arranged at perfect angles, a graphics tablet, and color-coded notebooks filled with client specifications and creative sketches. Sarah sat curled in her favorite chair, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands, as she stared at the text message from Janet that had been haunting her since Friday evening. "Sarah, I have someone I want you to meet. Good guy, single dad, works in marketing. Interested in a dinner date next Friday. I promise this one will be different." The same promise Janet had made 17 times before. Sarah's reflection looked back at her from her computer monitor's black screen, and she hardly recognized the woman staring back. 3 years ago, she'd been Sarah Mitchell high school music teacher, church pianist, the woman who could make a room full of teenagers fall in love with Mozart or coax melody from the most reluctant student. 3 years ago, she'd been planning a wedding to Michael, discussing children's names and mortgages and the 1,000 small compromises that make up a shared future. 3 years ago, she'd been someone else entirely. The accident had taken more than her hearing. It had taken her career, her relationship, her confidence, and her sense of identity. Everything she'd defined herself by the ability to hear the subtle difference between a student playing mechanically and one beginning to understand music, the joy of accompanying the church choir, the intimate conversations she and Michael used to have in whispered tones after lights out. All of it had vanished in the screech of brakes and the sickening crunch of metal. Sarah closed her eyes, but the memories came anyway. Waking up in the hospital to a world gone silent, doctors moving their mouths with expressions of sympathy she couldn't hear. Learning to read lips while her head still throbbed from the impact. The devastating realization that the ringing in her ears wasn't temporary. Michael had tried, she gave him credit for that. For almost 8 months he'd stayed. He'd learned basic sign language, though he'd complained it felt awkward. He'd researched hearing aids and cochlear implants with the determined optimism of someone who believed every problem had a solution. He'd held her while she cried through the grief of losing not just her hearing, but everything her hearing had made possible. But Michael had fallen in love with a woman who could hear his voice, who could listen to his carefully crafted playlists, who could whisper secrets in the dark. He hadn't signed up to learn a new language just to communicate with his fiancée, hadn't planned on dating someone who needed accommodations and patience and understanding. The breakup had been almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He'd sat her down in his living room and explained with careful kindness that he couldn't envision a future where they couldn't share music together, couldn't dance to songs at their wedding, couldn't have the life they'd planned. "It's not fair to either of us," he'd said, and the worst part was that Sarah could see his point. She couldn't offer him what he'd fallen in love with anymore. That had been 2.5 years ago. Since then, Sarah had rebuilt her life piece by careful piece. She'd learned graphic design online, discovered a talent for visual communication that had been dormant while she'd focused on auditory beauty. She'd built a client base through freelance platforms, specializing in accessibility consulting for websites and marketing materials. She'd found purpose again, even if it looked nothing like the purpose she'd imagined. But dating? Dating had been a series of disasters that would have been comical if they hadn't been happening to her. The coffee shop incident, where the man had left mid-conversation when he realized she couldn't hear the barista calling orders. The dinner where her date had spent the entire evening speaking loudly and slowly, as if she were cognitively impaired rather than deaf. The setup where the man had actually brought a pen and paper and insisted on writing everything down instead of speaking, treating her like a fascinating but challenging puzzle to solve rather than a woman he might want to get to know. The worst had been David 3 months ago. He'd seemed different at first, patient when she explained she'd need to watch his lips, to follow the conversation, interested in learning about deaf culture, asking thoughtful questions about her experience. She'd let herself hope, had even practiced introducing him to her small circle of friends. Then, during their 4th date, his phone had buzzed with what was clearly an urgent work call. Without thinking, he'd answered it, launching into a rapid conversation while Sarah sat across from him, suddenly invisible. When he'd hung up 20 minutes later and realized she'd been sitting in complete silence, unable to follow any of the one-sided conversation, his first words had been, "Oh, sorry. I forgot." "You forgot," she'd repeated the words, tasting like ash. About the deaf thing he'd clarified, apparently not understanding why she was standing up and gathering her purse. The deaf thing. As if her entire experience of the world, the way she navigated communication and relationships and daily life, could be reduced to a minor inconvenience he occasionally forgot about. Sarah had walked out, driven home, and cried for 3 hours. Not just for the rejection, but for the reminder that even the well-meaning ones saw her disability before they saw her. Now, staring at Janet's message, Sarah felt the familiar war between hope and exhaustion. Janet's intentions were good, had always been good. As Sarah's former colleague from the music department, Janet had maintained their friendship through the transition, had been one of the few people who'd seen Sarah's new career success, rather than just her hearing loss. But Janet also had an unshakable faith in the power of love to overcome all obstacles, and her track record for setting Sarah up was, to put it generously, abysmal. Still, something about this message felt different. Janet hadn't oversold the man or made promises about how perfect he was for her. She'd just said he was good, a single dad, and that this one would be different. Sarah's phone buzzed with a follow-up text. His name is James. Works at Morrison Marketing. Lost his wife a few years back, raising his daughter alone. I really think you two would connect. No pressure, but I have a feeling about this one. A widower. Someone who understood loss, who'd had to rebuild his life around tragedy. Someone who might understand that broken didn't mean worthless. Sarah picked up her phone and typed a response before she could second-guess herself. Okay, one more try. But Janet, if this goes badly, I'm officially retiring from dating and becoming a crazy cat lady. Deal, came Janet's immediate reply. But I won't need the backup plan. Trust me on this one. As Sarah went through her evening routine, checking tomorrow's client deadlines, reviewing design mock-ups, preparing for another day of building a life that looked nothing like the one she'd planned, she tried to quell the tiny spark of hope that Janet's confidence had ignited. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe James, the widowed single father from marketing, would be the one who saw past the hearing aids to the woman beneath. Maybe he'd be patient with the need to face him when he spoke. Maybe he'd understand that communication took many forms. Or maybe Friday evening would be disaster number 18, and she'd finally have enough evidence to convince Janet that some stories didn't get happy endings. But as Sarah drifted off to sleep in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the visual beauty she'd learned to create, in the absence of sound, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be seen, really seen, by someone who understood that love didn't require perfection. Tomorrow she'd prepare for another potential disappointment. Tonight, she'd let herself hope. Friday evening descended on Riverside Bistro with the golden warmth of late summer casting long shadows across the restaurant's outdoor patio and filling the interior with the kind of amber light that made every conversation feel intimate. The bistro had been chosen specifically for this evening's events, upscale enough to suggest serious intentions, but casual enough that a quick exit wouldn't seem dramatically rude. Ryan Matthews arrived first, his stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been guilt if he allowed himself to examine it too closely. He'd spent the last week oscillating between righteous excitement about finally exposing James Wilson's true character and uncomfortable moments of wondering if what they were planning crossed a line they shouldn't cross. But then he'd remember the promotion, the financial strain, the unfairness of being passed over for someone who'd barely paid his dues. The doubts would retreat, replaced by cold determination. Mike Chen and Brad Rodriguez arrived within minutes of each other, their faces reflecting Ryan's own nervous energy. They'd chosen a corner booth with perfect sightlines to the table, where James would be seated far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough for their phones to capture clear video. "Equipment check," Ryan murmured, adjusting the small stand he'd brought to hold his phone. The device was positioned to look like he was simply video chatting with someone, but the camera angle captured the entire center section of the restaurant. "I still think this feels wrong," Mike said quietly, his conscience making one last attempt to surface. "What if he really is just a decent guy? Then we'll have video evidence of that too," Ryan replied, though his tone suggested he considered the possibility laughable. "But trust me when push comes to shove, when he's actually inconvenienced by someone's disability, instead of just giving pretty speeches about inclusion, we'll see who James Wilson really is." Brad leaned forward, checking his own phone's recording angle. "What time is Janet's friend supposed to arrive?" 7:15, Ryan said, consulting his watch. "James got here at 7 sharp. I saw him get seated at table 12. Perfect punctuality from our golden boy. From their vantage point, they could see James clearly." He sat alone at a table by the window, adjusting his napkin nervously. Checking his phone, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of deep anxiety. Ryan found himself irritated, even by James's obvious nervousness. Was this part of the act too? The humble, uncertain, single father venturing into dating for the first time in years. "He looks scared," Mike observed, and there was something almost sympathetic in his voice. "He should be," Ryan muttered. But even as he said it, he noticed something odd about James's nervous gestures. The man's hands moved in small, specific patterns. When he was agitated, not random fidgeting, but precise movements that almost looked like... "Is he doing something with his hands?" Brad asked, following Ryan's gaze. Ryan squinted, trying to make sense of the subtle gestures. Probably just nervous habits. Rich boy probably went to some fancy private school where they taught proper hand positioning or something. But the movements looked more purposeful than that, more like communication than fidgeting. Ryan dismissed the observation he was here to expose James, not to psychoanalyze his mannerisms. At 7:12, their server approached to take their order. Ryan ordered quickly, his attention focused on the entrance, where in just a few minutes, Janet's deaf friend would walk into what he was certain would be a beautifully documented disaster. "Showtime," he whispered, as the restaurant door opened at exactly 7:15. Sarah Mitchell entered Riverside Bistro with the careful confidence of someone who'd learned to assess environments quickly, her eyes scanning the space for potential challenges. Loud background music that might interfere with her ability to read lips, dim lighting that might make communication difficult, crowded spaces that might require her to squeeze past people who wouldn't realize she couldn't hear their "excuse me." She was beautiful, Ryan had to admit. Janet hadn't oversold her friend's appearance. Blonde hair catching the light, elegant dress that suggested someone who took care of herself, an overall presence that would certainly catch attention. For a moment, Ryan almost felt bad about what they were planning. Almost. But then he reminded himself that this wasn't about Sarah. This was about James, about finally proving that the man's reputation for kindness was nothing more than carefully crafted performance art. Sarah approached the hostess stand, and Ryan activated his phone's recording function. This was it, the moment of truth. In just a few minutes, they'd watch James Wilson's carefully constructed facade crumble when he realized what Janet had set him up with. The hostess led Sarah toward table 12, and Ryan felt his heart racing with anticipation. James would realize she was deaf within the first few moments of interaction, the careful lip reading, the way she responded to visual cues rather than auditory ones. And then, when he understood that his perfect evening had become complicated, when his charitable reputation collided with actual inconvenience, they'd capture the exact moment his mask slipped. "Here we go." Ryan breathed, his finger poised over the record button. He had no idea he was about to witness something that would completely shatter every assumption he'd made about the man he thought he knew. Time moved differently in moments of revelation, stretching like taffy as understanding dawned and preconceptions crumbled. For Ryan Matthews, frozen in his corner booth with his phone recording the next 60 seconds, would rewrite everything he thought he knew about human nature, about kindness, and about the man he'd been so certain was a fraud. Sarah approached table 12 with the measured grace of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with deliberate awareness. Her eyes tracked the hostess's lips as the woman spoke her response, coming with the slight delay that indicated careful processing of visual information. James Wilson stood as she neared, and Ryan leaned forward, waiting for the moment of recognition, the split second when understanding would cross James's features and his true character would reveal itself. This was it, the unguarded moment when civility would give way to genuine reaction. But what happened next defied every prediction, shattered every assumption, and left Ryan staring in complete disbelief. James's face didn't fall with disappointment or flash with annoyance. Instead, something extraordinary occurred. His expression shifted through a cascade of emotions, recognition, understandings, and then something that looked almost like relief, Sarah James said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed to grow more genuine rather than more forced. "I'm James." Sarah's eyes focused intently on his mouth as he spoke, her own smile warm but cautious as she took his offered hand. "It's wonderful to meet you," she replied, her voice carrying the distinct tonal quality that indicated she couldn't monitor her own volume auditorily. Ryan watched James's face carefully, waiting for the moment of awkwardness, the uncomfortable realization, the polite excuse that would follow. But instead of discomfort, James seemed to pause, as if processing information and reaching a decision that surprised even him. And then James did something that made Ryan's phone nearly slip from his suddenly nerveless fingers. James lifted his hands. His fingers moved with fluid grace, forming shapes and gestures that were clearly purposeful. Clearly communication. His hands spoke in a language Ryan didn't understand but could recognize as fluent, natural, beautiful. "Hello," Sarah James signed his movements, confident and warm. "It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you for being here tonight." Sarah's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her mouth formed a perfect O of shock, her eyes going wide with the kind of disbelief that comes when the impossible suddenly becomes real. For a long moment, she simply stared at his hands, then at his face, then back at his hands, as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Then Sarah's own hands flew up, trembling with emotion, as she signed back. "You know sign language?" "My mother was deaf," James replied, his hands moving with 35 years of practice, settling into his chair with the ease of someone for whom this form of communication was as natural as breathing. "It's still my first language, honestly." From their surveillance position, Ryan felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crumble. Mike's mouth had fallen open, his own shock reflected in his wide eyes. Brad had stopped pretending to eat entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "This can't be happening," Ryan whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Did you know?" Mike breathed. "Did Janet know he could sign?" "No," Ryan said numbly. Nobody knew. How did nobody know? But even as he asked the question, pieces began falling into place. The way James's hands moved when he was nervous, not random fidgeting, but muscle memory from a childhood spent communicating through gesture. The inclusion initiatives at work that seemed to come from genuine understanding rather than corporate obligation. The careful attention he paid to colleagues as if he was accustomed to reading more than just words in conversation. On the recording that was meant to capture cruelty, they were instead witnessing something beautiful unfold. Sarah's hands had stopped trembling as she signed. "I wasn't expecting this. Nobody ever—" She paused, started again. "You're really fluent." 35 years of practice, James signed with a gentle smile. "My mom made sure of it. She said if I was going to live in her world, I needed to speak her language properly." Sarah pressed her hands flat against the white tablecloth, as if she needed to ground herself in something solid. When she looked up at James, her eyes were glistening with tears that spoke not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. I wasn't expecting this. She signed again, her movements slower now, more controlled. In 3 years of dating since my accident, I've never... She stopped seeming to search for the right signs to express what she was feeling. You don't have to explain. James signed back. I can imagine it's been difficult. People can be... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Unkind sometimes when they don't understand. The conversation continued flowing between signed and spoken words with a naturalness that spoke of James's lifetime of bilingual communication. Sarah's shoulders gradually relaxed, her guarded expression melting into something open and genuinely happy. They were connecting, really truly connecting in a way that was beautiful to witness and absolutely devastating to Ryan's worldview. He's supposed to be making excuses right now, Ryan said, desperately, his voice barely above a whisper. He's supposed to be checking his watch, looking uncomfortable, finding reasons to leave. Look at him, Mike said quietly, and there was something strange in his voice. That's not discomfort. That's not an act. He's actually enjoying himself. And he was. James leaned forward with genuine interest, his face animated as his hands moved through signs. There was nothing forced about his attention, nothing performative about his engagement. He wasn't tolerating the situation or enduring it out of politeness. He was connecting with Sarah as naturally as breathing. This can't be right, Ryan insisted, but doubt had crept into his voice like water through cracks. Maybe he learned a few signs to impress her. Maybe he's winging it and it'll fall apart when the conversation gets more complex. But even as he said it, watching James laugh at something Sarah had signed, watching their conversation flow with increasing ease and comfort, Ryan knew he was grasping at straws. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't someone struggling through half-remembered phrases from a language class. This was fluency. This was natural, unconscious, beautiful communication between two people who were discovering they could truly understand each other. Keep recording, Ryan said weakly, though his earlier conviction had evaporated entirely. Maybe something will still happen. But watching James and Sarah together, seeing the way Sarah's face had lit up with joy and relief, witnessing the careful tenderness with which James engaged in conversation with someone who clearly hadn't expected to be seen, and understood, Ryan felt something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. It looked exactly like the realization that he had been completely, utterly, devastatingly wrong about everything. The conversation that unfolded over the next hour was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in 3 years of cautious re-entry into the dating world. James didn't speak slowly or exaggerate his signs. He didn't treat her like she was fragile or simple or in need of special accommodation. He simply talked to her like she was a person he genuinely wanted to know, switching seamlessly between spoken English and ASL, depending on what felt most natural in the moment. So you're a graphic designer, James signed, leaning forward with real interest. What kind of projects do you work on? Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected, her usual defensive walls lowering as she responded. Mostly content marketing and web design, some accessibility consulting for companies that want to make their materials more inclusive. She paused, then added with a slight smile, It's not the career I planned, but I love the problem-solving aspect of it. What did you plan? James asked, his expression open and curious rather than pitying. I was a music teacher, Sarah signed, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the familiar stab of grief that usually accompanied that admission. High school and middle school. I also played piano for our church. James's face showed understanding rather than the awkward sympathy she'd grown accustomed to. That must have been a significant adjustment. It was Sarah agreed. For a while I thought my life was over. Music had been everything to me, how I understood the world, how I connected with other people, how I made my living. When I lost that, I had to figure out who I was without it. And who are you without it? James asked the question, carrying genuine curiosity rather than therapeutic probing. Sarah considered this, realizing it had been a long time since anyone had asked her to define herself by who she was becoming rather than what she'd lost. I'm someone who's learned to see beauty differently, to communicate in ways I never expected, to help other people navigate accessibility in a world that isn't always designed for everyone. That's beautiful, James sighed, and something in his expression suggested he meant it deeply. Their server approached to take their orders, and James smoothly transitioned to spoken English, while simultaneously signing the specials for Sarah, translating the server's rapid-fire descriptions without her having to ask. The gesture was so natural, so considerate, that Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been closed and protected for a very long time. You said your mother was deaf, Sarah signed after their server left. Tell me about her. James's entire demeanor shifted, his face softening with memory and love. Fierce, he signed the movement, sharp and definitive. That's always the first word that comes to mind. She refused to let anyone make her feel less than whole because she couldn't hear. She worked as a teacher at the state school for the deaf, and she was absolutely beloved. She sounds incredible. James agreed. She taught me that deafness isn't a limitation, it's just a different way of experiencing the world. She used to say that hearing people missed so much because they relied too heavily on just one sense. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I wish I could have met her. She would have loved you, James said with certainty. She had a gift for seeing people's strength, especially when they couldn't see it themselves. As their conversation continued, Sarah found herself sharing things she hadn't talked about in years. The frustration of having people speak about her in third person when she was standing right there. The exhaustion of constantly having to advocate for basic accommodations. The loneliness of feeling like she existed in a space between two worlds, not quite hearing, not quite integrated into deaf culture. The hardest part isn't the practical stuff, Sarah signed, her hands moving with growing confidence. It's the way people see you differently. Like you're either inspiration porn or a tragedy, never just a regular person trying to live their life. James nodded with understanding that seemed to come from experience rather than sympathy. My mom dealt with that her entire life. She used to say that some people were so busy being impressed by what she couldn't do that they missed everything she could do. Exactly, Sarah signed, relief flooding through her at being truly understood. I've had dates where men treated me like I was some kind of saint for functioning in the world with a disability, and others where they clearly saw me as a charity case. Which is worse, James asked. Honestly, the charity case thing. At least when someone puts you on a pedestal, they're acknowledging you're a person. When they see you as something to be pitied, and helped you become a project instead of a potential partner. James was quiet for a moment, and when he signed again, his movements were careful, thoughtful. Can I ask about your accident? Sarah had told this story so many times it had become almost scripted, but somehow with James, it felt like she was sharing it for the first time. Car accident 3 years ago. I wasn't even driving. I was a passenger. The other car ran a red light and hit us on the driver's side. My friend who was driving walked away with minor injuries. I ended up with severe head trauma that damaged my auditory nerves. I'm sorry, James signed, and his expression carried genuine grief for her loss. The cruel irony is that it happened 2 weeks before my wedding, Sarah continued. Michael. My fiancé tried to be supportive, but he'd fallen in love with someone who could share music with him, who could hear his voice when he spoke softly. 8 months later, he very kindly explained that he couldn't envision our future anymore. James's jaw tightened slightly. That must have been devastating. It was Sarah agreed. But in hindsight, I realize he did us both a favor. I needed someone who could love all of me, not just the parts that were convenient or familiar. You deserved better than that. James signed firmly. I'm beginning to think so, Sarah replied, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant it. As their food arrived, and they continued talking, Sarah discovered that James was funny in a way that didn't rely on making her the punchline. He told her about his daughter Emma, his face lighting up with paternal pride as he described her obsession with volcanoes and her tendency to correct adults when they were factually wrong about dinosaurs. "She's 7 going on 35, James explained. "Last week she informed me that my method of loading the dishwasher was inefficient and potentially damaging to our glassware." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "She sounds incredible. And terrifying. She's the best thing that ever happened to me." James signed with such tenderness that Sarah felt her heart squeeze. "She's also the reason I haven't dated in 5 years. 5 years, Sarah's eyebrows rose. James looked slightly embarrassed. "My wife died when Emma was 2. Heart condition nobody knew about. One day Catherine was planning Emma's 3rd birthday party. 3 days later she was gone. I've spent the last 5 years learning how to be both parents, trying to give Emma stability and normalcy." The rawness of his grief, still evident after all this time, made Sarah's chest ache with sympathy. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." It was James admitted. "For a long time I convinced myself that Emma and I were enough, that we didn't need anyone else complicating our lives. But Emma's been asking questions lately about why I don't date, why our family looks different from other families at her school. What kind of questions? Whether I'm still sad about her mummy, whether I'm lonely, whether I might want to find someone to share our lives with." James paused. "She told me last week that she thinks Catherine would want me to be happy again. She sounds like a wise little girl." "Too wise sometimes." James agreed. "She's the one who convinced me to say yes to this date. She said I needed to be brave enough to try living again, not just surviving." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the wine they'd ordered. "And how is that working out so far?" James met her eyes directly, his hands moving with deliberate sincerity. "This is the most real conversation I've had with another adult in 5 years. You're funny, intelligent, talented, and you've reminded me that there's a whole world out there beyond just getting through each day." From their corner booth, the surveillance team had long since stopped recording, the weight of what they were witnessing settling over them like ash. They were watching something they'd never expected to see. Genuine human connection. Real kindness. Authentic love beginning to bloom. "We need to stop this," Mike said quietly, his voice thick with guilt. Stop what Ryan asked, but his earlier conviction had completely evaporated. This Mike gestured toward James and Sarah's table. "They're actually connecting. They're happy. What we planned, it was cruel, and we were wrong about everything." Ryan stared at James and Sarah, watching them laugh together, seeing the way Sarah's face had been transformed by joy, witnessing the gentle kindness with which James engaged with her. Everything he'd believed about James Wilson's character had been built on resentment and assumption rather than fact. "Yeah," Ryan said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "We were wrong about everything." The moment of truth came not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but with the quiet observation of a man who'd spent 5 years learning to notice details others missed. James had been aware of the corner booth's occupants since shortly after Sarah arrived. 3 men whose attention seemed focused on their table rather than their own conversation. In his previous life before Catherine's death, before single parenthood had made him hyper-aware of potential threats to his carefully constructed stability, he might not have noticed. But raising a daughter alone had sharpened his protective instincts, made him attuned to when he was being watched. It took him 20 minutes to recognize the faces. Ryan Matthews from accounting, along with 2 colleagues James knew only in passing. They sat with phones positioned toward his table, their body language screaming guilt and conspiracy. The realization hit him like ice water. This had been a setup. Sarah was in the middle of signing a story about her cat's ongoing war with the neighborhood squirrels when she noticed James's attention had shifted, his face growing tight with something that looked like anger. "What's wrong?" she signed, following his gaze toward the corner booth. James made a decision that would have surprised the men who'd planned this evening. Instead of confronting them directly, instead of making a scene that would humiliate Sarah and ruin what had been a beautiful evening, he chose honesty. "Sarah," he signed carefully, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to know it doesn't change anything about tonight or how I feel about meeting you." Sarah's hands stilled, her expression growing cautious. "What is it? I think this was a setup." James explained, his signs controlled, despite the anger building in his chest. "Those 3 men in the corner booth, they're colleagues of mine. They've been watching us all evening, and I believe they're recording us." Sarah's face went through a cascade of emotions. Confusion, hurt, dawning, understanding. Then something harder. "Recording us," she signed, her movements sharp with barely contained fury. "I think they expected—" James paused, struggling with how to explain without making her feel like a pawn in someone else's game. "They expected you to be cruel to the deaf girl." Sarah finished, her hands cutting through the air with precise anger. "This was a test of your character, and I was the bait." James felt his jaw clench. "Yes." For a long moment, Sarah didn't sign anything. She sat perfectly still, staring at the corner booth where 3 men were now clearly uncomfortable, their conspiracy unraveling under her direct gaze. "I've been on 17 blind dates in the past 3 years. Sarah finally signed, each movement weighted with exhausted resignation. 17 times I've watched men's faces change when they realize I'm deaf. Some leave immediately, at least they're honest about their rejection. Some stay out of pity, which is infinitely worse. Some treat me like I'm broken and need fixing." Her hands moved faster now, emotion spilling over into her gestures. "You're the first person who just treated me. Like I'm a complete person worth knowing, not a disability to overcome, not a charity case, not a test of someone's character. Just me." She turned to look directly at the corner booth, then back at James. "So what now? Was this real, or was I just part of their experiment?" James's hands moved with absolute conviction. "Sarah, I don't care what they intended. I don't care that they set this up to humiliate me or sabotage my career. I don't care that they used you as an unwitting accomplice in their plan." He waited until her eyes met his fully, until he was certain she could see the sincerity in his expression as well as his signs. "This conversation, this connection, this evening, it's been the most genuine thing I've experienced in 5 years. You're brilliant, funny, talented, and you've reminded me that there's life beyond just surviving each day with my daughter." James took a breath, then continued with words he'd never expected to say to someone he'd met 3 hours ago. "If you'll let me, I'd like to see you again. Not because of some setup or test, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I genuinely want to know you better." "You mean that Sarah signed, tentative hope flickering in her expression. "Completely?" James replied. "When you laugh, it makes everyone around you want to smile. When you talk about your work, your passion is infectious. Tonight has been special, and that has nothing to do with whatever game they were playing." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or pity. What she found instead was honesty, genuine interest, and something that looked remarkably like wonder. "I'd like that too," she signed slowly. "I'd like that very much." The restaurant around them continued its Friday evening rhythm. Other diners focused on their own conversations and connections. But in their small corner of the world, James and Sarah had found something neither had been looking for when the evening began. From their booth, Ryan, Mike, and Brad had watched the conversation with growing discomfort. Even without being able to follow the signed portion, they could read the body language, could see the moment James explained the situation, and the way Sarah's face had hardened with anger and hurt. "We have to do something," Mike said desperately. "We have to tell them." "Tell them what?" Ryan interrupted, his voice hollow. "That we're sorry. That we were wrong about James's character. That we used an innocent woman as bait in our petty revenge scheme." "Yes," Mike said firmly. "All of that." Brad nodded, his face pale with guilt. "We created this situation. We owe them an explanation at the very least." Ryan stared at his phone's black screen. The recording stopped long ago when it became clear they weren't capturing what they'd expected. Instead of evidence of cruelty, they'd documented something beautiful. Genuine human connection. Real kindness, authentic interest between two people who'd found unexpected compatibility. "They look happy," Ryan observed quietly, watching James and Sarah's continued conversation. "Actually happy." "They do," Mike agreed, "and we almost ruined that with our assumptions and resentment." As the evening wound down and other diners began to leave, Ryan made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of slinking away to avoid confrontation, he stood up from the booth. "Where are you going?" Brad asked. "To apologize," Ryan said simply. "It's not going to fix what we did, but it's a start." Mike and Brad exchanged glances, then stood as well. Together, the three men who'd planned an evening of cruelty walked toward the table where James and Sarah were finishing their dessert and coffee, their faces reflecting the shame and guilt that had been building all evening. James saw them approaching and gently touched Sarah's hand to get her attention. She turned, following his gaze, and both of them watched with curiosity rather than anger as their unwitting audience approached. James Ryan said when they reached the table, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, we owe you both an enormous apology." The confession that followed was painful and complete. Ryan explained about the promotion, about his resentment and assumption that James's kindness was performative, about their plan to expose what they'd believed was fake character by putting him in a situation they'd thought would reveal his true nature. "We were wrong," Mike said when Ryan's voice failed him. "Completely, utterly wrong. About James's character, about what we'd witnessed tonight, about the cruelty of using you as an unwitting participant in our scheme. What we did was inexcusable," Brad added, his face flushed with shame. "Using someone's disability as a test, as bait. There's no justification for that level of cruelty." Sarah listened to the apology with an expression that was difficult to read, her hands resting calmly on the table. When they finished, she looked at each of them in turn before signing her response, which James translated aloud. "She says that your assumptions about disabled people being burdens or inconveniences reveal more about your character than about ours," James spoke for Sarah. "But she appreciates your honesty in coming forward." Ryan felt the weight of her measured response, the dignity with which she handled their confession. "We're resigning from the project that would have put us in competition with James for the promotion," he said. "We'll be recommending him for the position with a full explanation of why he deserves it." James looked surprised. "That's not necessary." "It is," Ryan interrupted. "We've learned something tonight about character, about kindness, and about the danger of assumptions. The least we can do is ensure that our mistakes don't cost you an opportunity you've earned." As the three men walked away, leaving James and Sarah alone again, Sarah reached across the table and took James's hand. "That was unexpected," she signed with her free hand. "Which part?" James asked. "All of it," Sarah replied, "but especially the part where they actually apologized, and the part where you handled it with grace instead of anger." James considered this. "I spent 5 years learning that holding on to anger just steals energy you need for better things. They made a mistake based on wrong assumptions, but they owned it. That takes courage. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Your daughter is lucky to have a father who models forgiveness along with strength. Speaking of Emma, James said, his own smile widening. She's going to want to meet you. Fair warning, she has very strong opinions about dinosaurs, and she will quiz you extensively on volcanic activity. I can handle dinosaurs and volcanoes, Sarah signed. The real question is whether I can handle her father's jokes. You haven't told any yet, and that's making me suspicious. James laughed, the sound carrying across the restaurant. Smart woman. I was saving them for the second date. Confident there'll be a second date, Sarah teased. Hopeful James replied, his expression growing serious. Very hopeful. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, neither James nor Sarah could have imagined how profoundly this evening would change their lives. What had begun as a cruel test had transformed into something beautiful, proving that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most meaningful connections. Saturday afternoon arrived with the particular brand of nervous energy that James had thought he'd left behind with his teenage years. He stood in his kitchen at 2:47 p.m., checking the clock for the fourth time in 5 minutes, adjusting flowers that were already perfectly arranged, and trying to convince himself that introducing Emma to Sarah was a logical next step, rather than a terrifying leap into uncharted territory. Emma, for her part, had approached the situation with the strategic planning of a military operation. She'd changed clothes twice, finally settling on her favorite purple shirt with sparkly stars, because, as she'd explained with 7-year-old logic, sparkles are friendly and Sarah needs to know I'm friendly. Daddy, you're doing the nervous hand thing again, Emma observed from her perch at the kitchen table, where she was adding finishing touches to the welcome banner she'd insisted on making. The poster board was decorated with rainbow's flowers and what appeared to be a pterodactyl wearing a smile. James looked down at his hands, realizing he'd been unconsciously signing worried and excited in repetitive patterns. Sorry, Bug. I guess I am nervous. Why? Emma asked, setting down her crayons and fixing him with the direct stare that never failed to cut through his adult complications. Sarah likes you, right? And you like her, yes, but... And she's coming to meet me because she wants to know about all the parts of your life, right? Right, but... And I want to meet her because she makes you smile the way you haven't smiled since Mummy went to heaven, right? James felt his throat tighten with emotion. When had his daughter become so perceptive about his emotional state? Right. Emma nodded with satisfaction. Then there's nothing to be nervous about. We're all going to like each other because we all already like you. The simple logic of childhood cut through weeks of anxiety with surgical precision. James knelt beside Emma's chair and pulled her into a hug. When did you get so wise I was born wise? Emma replied matter-of-factly. You just started noticing. At exactly 3:00 p.m., Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. James had offered to pick her up, but she'd insisted on driving herself, a small assertion of independence that he'd immediately understood and respected. Through the living room window, they watched Sarah navigate the path from her car to the front door with the efficient confidence of someone who'd learned to assess new environments quickly. She carried a small bag that Emma immediately identified as present-shaped. She brought me something Emma whispered with delight. I told you she was nice. When James opened the door, Sarah's smile was warm but slightly nervous, her eyes immediately seeking Emma behind him. She wore jeans and a soft yellow sweater that made her look approachable and comfortable, exactly the right choice for meeting a 7-year-old who would judge her on friendliness rather than fashion. Hi, Sarah said aloud, then lifted her hands to include Emma in the greeting. You must be Emma. Your dad has told me so much about you. Emma stepped forward with the confident curiosity that James both loved and occasionally worried about. Hi, Sarah. Can you teach me to say hello with my hands? Sarah's face lit up with genuine delight. She knelt to Emma's level and slowly demonstrated the sign for hello, guiding Emma's small hands through the movement with patient gentleness. Like this, Emma asked, repeating the sign with concentrated effort. Perfect. Sarah signed and spoke simultaneously, her approval making Emma beam with pride. Daddy taught me a few signs already, Emma announced, then carefully formed the signs for nice to meet you that James had helped her practice. The movements were imperfect, but the intention was clear. Sarah's eyes immediately filled with tears, happy tears that she quickly blinked back. She signed something in response that was too fast for Emma to follow, so James translated. She says she's honored to meet you, and that you're very good at sign language. Can she teach me more? Emma asked, her enthusiasm bubbling over. I'd love to, Sarah replied, then reached into her bag and pulled out a wrapped package. I brought you something. Your dad mentioned you like volcanoes. Emma's eyes went wide as she unwrapped the gift to reveal a book titled The Magic of Volcanoes. A visual journey filled with photographs and diagrams that would appeal to both her scientific curiosity and her love of beautiful pictures. This is the best book ever, Emma declared with the absolute certainty of childhood, immediately flipping through pages and gasping at the dramatic photos of erupting volcanoes. Look, Daddy, you can see the lava flying through the air. As Emma became absorbed in her new book, James and Sarah moved to the kitchen, where he'd prepared coffee and the cookies Emma had helped him bake that morning. Well helped was generous. She'd mostly eaten chocolate chips and provided commentary while he did the actual work. She's incredible, Sarah signed while Emma was distracted. You've done such a beautiful job raising her. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping us both afloat, Ems admitted, leaning against the kitchen counter. This whole dating thing, bringing someone into her life, it terrifies me. Because of what happened with her mother? James nodded. Emma doesn't remember much about Catherine's death, she was so young. But she remembers the disruption, the confusion, the way everything changed overnight. I've spent 5 years trying to give her stability, predictability. Introducing someone new feels like risking that. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma through the kitchen doorway as the little girl continued her excited exploration of the volcano book. Can I tell you something? Of course. In the 3 years since my accident, Emma is the first child I've spent time with. Kids can be cruel about differences sometimes without meaning to be. They stare, they ask blunt questions, they make observations that adults have learned to keep to themselves. James felt his protective instincts flare. If she says anything inappropriate. She won't, Sarah interrupted gently. Do you know how I can tell how? Because she learned kindness from you. The way she approached me, the respect she showed for sign language, the genuine interest rather than curiosity about my disability that comes from being raised by someone who teaches acceptance through example. Before James could respond, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway with her book clutched to her chest. Sarah, can I show you my volcano collection? I have rocks and pictures and a model that we made that actually erupts with baking soda and vinegar. I would love to see your volcano collection, Sarah replied, her enthusiasm matching Emma's perfectly. What followed was a guided tour that took them through Emma's bedroom, where her extensive collection of geology books shared shelf space with stuffed animals and art supplies. Sarah examined each rock specimen with serious attention, asked thoughtful questions about Emma's drawings of different volcano types, and listened with genuine fascination as Emma explained the difference between explosive and effusive eruptions. You know a lot about volcanoes, Sarah observed, sitting cross-legged on Emma's bedroom floor while examining a piece of pumice. I want to be a volcanologist when I grow up, Emma announced. That's a scientist who studies volcanoes. I want to wear special suits and collect lava samples and help people know when eruptions are coming so they can be safe. That's an amazing goal, Sarah signed and spoke. Have you ever thought about learning the signs for different types of rocks and volcanic activity? There are volcanologists who are deaf, and they use ASL to communicate with their research teams. Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. Really? There are deaf volcano scientists. Really? And if you learned more sign language, you could communicate with any deaf scientists you work with in the future. James watched this exchange with growing warmth in his chest. Sarah wasn't just indulging Emma's interests, she was expanding them, opening doors to possibilities his daughter hadn't even known existed. "Will you teach me?" Emma asked, her hands already moving in approximations of signs she'd seen Sarah use. "I'd be honored to teach you," Sarah replied. They spent the next hour in what could only be described as an intensive introductory ASL lesson. Sarah taught Emma signs for different types of rocks, for scientific concepts, for emotions and descriptions. Emma absorbed it all with the focused intensity she usually reserved for volcano documentaries, practicing each sign until her movements were confident. By the time they moved back to the living room for the promised cookie tasting, Emma was carrying on basic conversations in a mixture of spoken English and sign language, with Sarah patiently correcting her mistakes and celebrating her successes. "These cookies are really good." Emma signed carefully, then looked to Sarah for confirmation that she'd gotten the movements right. "Perfect," Sarah confirmed, then turned to James with an expression of amused affection. "Did you make these yourself?" "With extensive supervision from my sous chef," James replied, gesturing toward Emma. "I helped Emma clarified, mostly by making sure the chocolate chips tasted right before we put them in the cookies." "Quality control is very important," Sarah agreed solemnly. As the afternoon wound toward evening, Emma had settled between James and Sarah on the couch, her volcano book open across all their laps as she pointed out different eruption types and practiced the signs Sarah had taught her for each one. "Sarah," Emma said, suddenly looking up from the book with the serious expression that usually preceded important announcements. "Are you going to keep coming to visit us?" The question hung in the air, loaded with more weight than its simple words suggested. James held his breath, realizing that Emma's acceptance was crucial to whatever might develop between him and Sarah. "Would you like me to keep visiting?" Sarah asked carefully. Emma nodded emphatically. "Yes. You're really fun, and you know about volcanoes, and you're teaching me a whole new language. Plus, Daddy smiles more when you're here." Sarah glanced at James, something soft and wondering in her expression. "In that case, I'd love to keep visiting." "Good," Emma said with satisfaction, "because I have a lot more questions about volcanoes, and Daddy doesn't know all the answers." As Sarah prepared to leave that evening, Emma hugged her goodbye with the unself-conscious affection that children gave when they'd decided someone was safe and welcome in their world. "Thank you for the book, and for teaching me signs, and for making Daddy happy," Emma whispered during the hug. James felt his throat tighten as he watched his daughter, his cautious, sometimes shy daughter, open her heart to this woman who'd appeared in their lives so unexpectedly. "Thank you for letting me be part of your day," Sarah replied, kneeling to Emma's level for the goodbye. "I had the most wonderful time learning about volcanoes and getting to know you." After Emma had gone upstairs to get ready for bed, James and Sarah stood in the hallway, the weight of the day's success settling between them. "That went better than I dared to hope," James admitted. "She's remarkable," Sarah signed. "Curious, intelligent kind. You should be incredibly proud." "I am?" And Sarah James paused, searching for words adequate to express what the afternoon had meant. "Thank you for seeing her. Really seeing her, not just tolerating her, because she's part of the package. The way you engaged with her interests expanded her horizons, treated her like a complete person worth knowing. That means everything to me. She is a complete person worth knowing," Sarah replied simply. "And she's lucky to have a father who recognizes that and nurtures it." As Sarah drove home that evening, she found herself smiling in a way she hadn't since before her accident. For the first time in 3 years, She'd experienced what it felt like to be welcomed into a family, to have her presence add value, rather than create accommodation, to be seen as someone who belonged, rather than someone who was being tolerated. In his living room, James stood looking at the pictures Emma had drawn earlier that day. Crayon illustrations of volcanoes that now included stick figures labeled Me, Daddy, and Sarah, standing together, watching eruptions from a safe distance. For the first time since Catherine's death, their family portrait included 3 people. And it felt exactly right. Monday morning arrived with the particular dread of unfinished business. James walked into the office to find Ryan and his 2 colleagues huddled by the coffee machine, their body language screaming discomfort. When they saw him, all 3 physically flinched. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. "James, we need to talk. I know what you did," James said quietly, his voice carrying across the break room. The confession came tumbling out like water through a broken dam. The promotion rumors, the insider information, the resentment that he, a newcomer of barely 12 months, was being considered for head therapist over people who'd been there for years. The plan to record his reaction to being set up with a disabled woman, to post it anonymously to the career forum, to destroy his reputation before the CFO could make the promotion official. We thought Ryan's voice cracked. "We thought you were faking the kindness, the work ethic, all of it. We thought it was an act to make yourself look good." "So you decided to test me," James said flatly. "Yes, and we were wrong about everything." Mike couldn't meet his eyes. "We watched that whole date. Watched you treat her with respect and genuine interest, watched you connect with her like a decent human being, and we realized we'd become people we're not proud of." Tim stepped forward. "We went to the CFO this morning before we came to you. Told him what we did, showed him the video, then deleted it. He's handling our disciplinary actions, but we wanted to apologize directly." Ryan's voice was raw. "What we did was cruel to you, and especially to Sarah. Using someone's disability as a punchline, as bait, there's no excuse for that." James was silent for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but laced with hurt. "You know what the saddest part is? If you'd just talked to me, gotten to know me, none of this would have been necessary. I'm not perfect. I lose my temper. I make mistakes. I burn dinner 3 times a week. And I still can't figure out how to make Emma's hair look decent for school photos." He looked at each of them in turn. "But I'm not putting on an act. I don't have the energy for that. I'm just trying to do good work and be a decent person. That shouldn't be threatening." "It's not," Ryan said quietly. "We made it threatening because of our own insecurity and resentment. That's on us, not you." James nodded slowly. "I appreciate you coming forward. It doesn't make it okay, but it's a start. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." He poured his coffee and walked away, leaving 3 men to sit with the consequences of their choices. 2 weeks later, the promotion came through. Head therapist. Significant raise, expanded responsibilities, an office with an actual window. But what mattered most to James was the text waiting on his phone when he walked out of the CFO's office. "Congratulations, Emma and I are so proud. Dinner tonight to celebrate. I'll bring the non-pineapple pizza." Sarah, James smiled, his thumb hovering over the reply button. 4 years ago he'd thought his story was finished, that he'd spend the rest of his life as just Emma's dad, going through the motions, surviving but not truly living. He'd been so wrong. He typed back, "It's a date. See you at 6. 3 weeks after their first meeting, James and Sarah had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. Saturday afternoons became Sarah's time with Emma. Their living room transformed into an impromptu ASL academy, where volcano facts mixed with sign language lessons and where a 7-year-old's enthusiasm proved to be the perfect catalyst for adult connection. The reason shield volcanoes have gentle slopes? Emma signed carefully, her small hands moving through the gestures Sarah had taught her for geological terms, is because the lava has low viscosity. She paused, looking proud of herself for remembering the technical vocabulary. Exactly right, Sarah confirmed, her face lighting up with genuine delight at Emma's progress. And what type of volcano has explosive eruptions? Stratovolcanoes, Emma signed with growing confidence, because the lava is more viscous and traps gas bubbles that build pressure. James watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, marveling at how seamlessly Sarah had integrated into their Saturday routine. She didn't just tolerate Emma's volcanic obsession, she'd expanded it, introducing concepts and vocabulary that challenged his daughter's quick mind while respecting her passionate interests. Sarah, Emma said, suddenly switching back to spoken English with the fluid bilingualism that children mastered so easily. Can I ask you something personal? James felt his parental instincts activate, ready to intervene if Emma's 7-year-old bluntness ventured into inappropriate territory. But Sarah nodded encouragingly. When you lost your hearing, were you scared? The question was direct in the way only children could manage, cutting through adult euphemisms to the heart of real experience. Sarah considered her response carefully. I was terrified, she admitted, her honesty refreshing after years of adults who wanted sanitized answers about disability. I thought I'd lost everything that made me who I was. I couldn't do my job anymore. I couldn't enjoy music the way I had my whole life, and I didn't know how to live in a world that suddenly felt completely different. Emma absorbed this with the serious attention she brought to complex subjects. But you learned how to be okay again. I learned how to be different, Sarah corrected gently. And eventually I learned that different doesn't mean less than. It just means finding new ways to do things I love and discovering things I never knew I could love. Like what? Like teaching sign language to curious 7-year-olds who ask excellent questions about volcanoes, Sarah said with a smile that made Emma giggle. Like designing websites that help other people with disabilities navigate the world more easily. Like meeting your dad and realizing that the right person doesn't see your differences as problems to solve. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. In 3 weeks, Sarah had become more than someone he was dating. She'd become someone who helped him see his own life more clearly, who brought out the best in Emma, who reminded him daily that love didn't require perfection. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed with her usual routine of hugs, stories, and the stuffed elephant she'd inherited from Catherine, James and Sarah sat on his small back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Can I tell you something? Sarah said suddenly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that she'd been protecting behind weeks of growing confidence. Anything. This terrifies me, she admitted, gesturing between them with a movement that encompassed their entire developing relationship. Not you specifically, but this. Being happy. Letting myself believe that this could work long term. James set down his wine glass, giving her his full attention. What scares you most about it? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage to voice fears she'd been carrying since their first date. The assumption that I should be grateful for any attention, that I shouldn't have standards or expectations, because who am I to be choosy? 3 years of failed dates taught me that most people see my deafness first and me second if they see me at all. She paused, then continued with words that had been building pressure behind her careful composure. And then you came along and you saw me first. You engaged with my interests, you made me laugh, you treated Emma's curiosity about my disability as an opportunity to learn rather than a source of awkwardness. You've been everything I didn't dare to hope for. But James prompted, gently sensing there was more. But I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah confessed. For the moment when my disability becomes inconvenient or embarrassing or just too much work. When you realize that dating someone who can't hear your voice, when you're not facing me, who needs accommodations for movies and concerts and phone calls, who lives in a world that's fundamentally different from yours when that stops being charming and starts being work. James reached for her hands, waiting until she looked at him directly before responding. Sarah, can I tell you what I see when I look at you? She nodded her eyes, reflecting the porch light, and something that might have been unshed tears. I see someone who rebuilt her entire life after losing something central to her identity. I see someone who took a devastating setback and turned it into a new career, helping other people. I see someone who learned my daughter's favorite subject well enough to teach it to her in a language Emma had never encountered before. He paused, making sure she could read the sincerity in his expression as well as his words. I see someone who makes me laugh, who challenges my assumptions, who brings patience and kindness to everything she does. I see the woman I'm falling in love with, and your deafness isn't something I'm overlooking or accommodating. It's part of who you are, and I love who you are. Sarah's breath caught. You're falling in love with me? I'm past falling, James admitted. I love you. I love your strength and your vulnerability. I love how you engage with Emma like she's a complete person worth knowing. I love how you've taught me that communication is about connection, not just words. Tears were flowing freely down Sarah's face now, but she was smiling. I love you too. I love how you see Emma as a miracle instead of a burden. I love how you treat every person with respect, regardless of their job title or circumstances. I love that you learned sign language from your mother and kept it as a gift you could share with someone who needed it. They sat together on the porch as the sun set, two people who'd found each other through the worst kind of circumstances, and discovered that sometimes the most unexpected connections become the most essential ones. So what do we do now? Sarah asked. Now we see what happens when we stop being careful and start being brave. James replied. Emma's already asked when you're going to move in. Apparently she's decided you're permanent family. What did you tell her? That these things take time, but that I hope she's right. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him and the impossible rightness of this moment. For the record, I hope she's right too. 2 months later, they'd fallen into patterns that felt like family. Sarah's key sat on James's keychain. Her coffee mug had a permanent place in his kitchen cabinet. Emma's ASL vocabulary had expanded to include complex scientific concepts and emotional nuances that impressed her teacher and delighted her friends. Dad, Emma announced one evening over dinner, using the sign for father that Sarah had taught her alongside the spoken word. I think we should get Sarah a Christmas stocking. James and Sarah exchanged glances across the kitchen table. Christmas was still 6 weeks away, but Emma had been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about making their family arrangements official. What makes you think Sarah wants a stocking here? James asked carefully. Because she's here every weekend, and most weekdays, and her toothbrush lives in our bathroom, and she knows where we keep the good cookies, Emma replied with 7-year-old logic that was difficult to argue with. Plus, she's teaching me sign language, and you can't just abandon a student in the middle of their education. She makes compelling points, Sarah signed to James with amusement. So can we? Emma pressed. Get her a stocking, and maybe put up 2 Christmas trees this year, one here and one at her apartment, so she knows she belongs in both places. James felt his heart squeeze with love for his daughter's generous spirit and her instinctive understanding of what it meant to make someone feel welcome. What do you think, Sarah, ready for Christmas stockings and dual Christmas trees? Sarah's answer came in sign and speech simultaneously. I think that sounds like the most beautiful Christmas I never dared to imagine. That night, as they prepared for bed in the house that had become theirs rather than just his, James realized that Catherine had been right about so many things, including her belief that love multiplied rather than divided, that families could grow and change, while honoring what came before, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply being brave enough to remain open to unexpected joy. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, its subject line deceptively simple. Senior Marketing Director, position. Decision notification. James stared at it for a full 30 seconds before opening it. His coffee growing cold as he processed what felt like the culmination of not just his professional trajectory, but his entire journey back to trusting that good things could happen. Dear James, the message began in the formal tone that corporate communications favored. We are pleased to inform you that following extensive review and consideration, you have been selected for the position of Senior Marketing Director, effective December 1st. The words should have brought immediate celebration, but instead James found himself thinking about the cost at which this opportunity had come. Ryan's confession to HR had triggered a thorough investigation that resulted in formal reprimands for all three conspirators, though they'd kept their jobs after demonstrating genuine remorse and commitment to professional growth. James Mike Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. Mike approached James's cubicle tentatively, his demeanor still carrying the careful humility that had characterized all his interactions since their confession 3 weeks earlier. Congratulations, Mike said quietly, gesturing toward the email that was still open on James's screen. I heard the announcement went out this morning. You deserve it. James looked up at his colleague. This man who'd participated in a plan to destroy his reputation and who now stood offering genuine congratulations. The complexity of workplace relationships, of human nature, of the capacity for growth and redemption struck him anew. Thank you, James replied, and meant it. How are you doing? I know the last few weeks have been difficult. Mike's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been gratitude. After participating in a scheme to humiliate James, he clearly hadn't expected this level of concern for his well-being. I'm learning a lot about my own assumptions and prejudices, Mike admitted. The sensitivity training HR required has been eye-opening. I never realized how much I'd internalized about people with disabilities, about what constitutes normal or whole or valuable. It's an ongoing process, James agreed. We all have blind spots. Some of us acted on ours in cruel ways, Mike said, his shame still evident. But James, what you and Sarah have built together, it's beautiful. My wife and I saw you all at the farmers' market last Saturday, and Emma was translating between sign language and spoken English like she'd been bilingual her entire life. That little girl is going to grow up with a perspective most adults never achieve. James felt a familiar swell of pride thinking about Emma's rapid progress with ASL and her growing awareness of accessibility and inclusion. At 7, she'd become a passionate advocate for making sure everyone could participate in conversations and activities. She's teaching me as much as Sarah is, James admitted. Children adapt so quickly to seeing the world in new ways. That evening, James arrived home to find Sarah and Emma in the kitchen collaborating on what appeared to be a celebration dinner. The smell of homemade bread filled the house, and Emma's homework lay forgotten on the counter as she practiced the sign for congratulations with intense focus. Surprise Emma shouted when she saw him, her verbal announcement accompanied by enthusiastic signing. Sarah taught me how to say congratulations, and we made your favorite dinner, and there's a cake, but you can't see it until after we eat vegetables. James laughed, the sound echoing through their kitchen, in a way that still amazed him, natural, unforced, the laughter of a man who'd remembered how to be happy. Who told you about the promotion? Janet called Sarah and Sarah called me, and I planned everything, Emma announced with the pride of someone who'd successfully orchestrated a major operation. Also, I drew you a picture of your new office, but I had to guess what it looks like because I've never seen it. Sarah moved from the stove to greet him with a kiss that tasted like pride and joy and shared accomplishment. Congratulations, Senior Marketing Director. How does it feel? Surreal, James admitted, pulling her close. And slightly guilty considering how this opportunity arose. James, Sarah signed with gentle firmness, you earned this position through your work, your character, and your qualifications. The fact that some colleagues initially questioned your motives doesn't diminish your achievements. Listen to Sarah. Emma chimed in, having followed enough of the signed conversation to understand the general context. She's very smart about everything. Over dinner, pot roast with vegetables that Emma ate without complaint because they were part of a celebration. James found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 months. The promotion was significant, but it paled in comparison to the family he'd gained, the love he'd found, the future he could suddenly envision. "There's something else," he said, as they shared the chocolate cake Emma had helped Sarah make. "Something I want to discuss with both of you." Emma perked up with the radar-like attention that children brought to adult conversations that might affect them. "The new position comes with some travel requirements," James continued. "Not extensive, but occasional conferences and client meetings. Before I accepted, I wanted to make sure we could handle the logistics as a family." "As a family," Sarah repeated, her hand stilling over her cake fork. "As a family," James confirmed, reaching for her hand. "Sarah, I know we haven't talked about timelines or official arrangements, but Emma's right. You're already family. Your toothbrush lives in our bathroom, you know where we keep the good cookies, and you've become essential to our daily happiness." Emma nodded sagely. "Plus, someone needs to help me with my sign language homework when Daddy travels, and he doesn't know advanced geological vocabulary yet." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "I see I'm valued for my educational contributions. You're valued for everything," James said seriously, "for the way you've embraced Emma and made her feel special rather than accommodated, for how you've helped me remember that I'm more than just a single parent going through motions, for the daily reminder that love doesn't require perfection, it just requires showing up." "So what are you asking?" Sarah inquired, though. Her smile suggested she already knew. "I'm asking if you'd consider making this official. Not marriage, not yet, though I hope we're heading there. But moving in together, combining our lives, making the family arrangement that already exists in practice into something intentional and permanent." Emma had stopped eating cake entirely, her attention focused on this conversation that would determine the shape of their future. "What do you think?" Emma Sarah asked, turning to include her in the decision. "Are you ready for me to officially be part of your daily life? I've been ready since the first day you came over and actually listened to my volcano explanations, instead of just pretending to be interested," Emma replied with characteristic directness. "Also, you make better pancakes than Daddy, and you help with math homework without getting frustrated when I don't understand something right away." "Those are compelling arguments," Sarah agreed solemnly. "Is that a yes?" James asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's a yes," Sarah confirmed, her eyes shining with tears that spoke of joy rather than sadness. "It's been a yes since that night at the restaurant, when you signed hello, and I realized that someone finally saw me, exactly as I am." Emma erupted in celebration, jumping up from her chair to hug both adults simultaneously. "This is the best day ever. We're going to be a real family, and I'll have someone to help me practice sign language every day, and maybe Sarah can teach me how to make cookies that don't burn on the bottom." As they cleaned up the kitchen together that evening, Emma signing the names of dishes as she dried them, Sarah and James moving around each other with the easy coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. James felt the deep satisfaction of a life rebuilt on stronger foundations than before. The promotion was wonderful, but it was just a job. This Emma's laughter, Sarah's presence, the sense of completeness that had been missing for 5 years, this was everything that mattered. Love had found him when he'd stopped looking for it in the most unexpected circumstances, with the most unlikely beginning. But maybe that was how the best stories always unfolded, not through careful planning or perfect timing, but through the courage to remain open to possibility even after loss, even after heartbreak, even after convincing yourself that certain kinds of happiness were no longer possible. Sometimes the most beautiful families were built not from tradition or expectation, but from choice acceptance and the daily decision to love each other exactly as they were. 1 year and 2 months after their first meeting at Riverside Bistro, James found himself sitting at the exact same table, his heart hammering against his ribs with a familiar rhythm of terror and anticipation. The restaurant looked almost identical to that pivotal Friday evening amber light spilling across white tablecloths. The quiet murmur of intimate conversations, the same sense of possibility hanging in the air. But everything else had changed completely. Emma sat beside him in the booth they'd specifically requested her 8-year-old frame, vibrating with the barely contained excitement of someone who'd been keeping a monumental secret for 2 weeks. She wore her favorite purple dress with sparkly stars, the same outfit she'd chosen for meeting Sarah that first Saturday afternoon, and her small hands moved restlessly as she fought the urge to practice the signs she'd memorized for this moment. "Is she here yet?" Emma whispered for the 4th time in 10 minutes, craning her neck to watch the restaurant entrance with the intensity of a surveillance specialist. "Not yet, Bug," James replied, checking his watch. 7:13 p.m. Sarah was never late, which meant she was probably sitting in her car right now, gathering courage for what she assumed was simply their anniversary dinner. "Daddy, you're doing the nervous hand thing again." Emma observed her own sign language vocabulary now sophisticated enough to recognize when her father was unconsciously spelling out anxious thoughts. James looked down at his hands, realizing he'd been signing terrified and hopeful in repetitive patterns. "I can't help it. What if she says no?" Emma fixed him with the direct stare that never failed to cut through adult complications. "Daddy, Sarah moved in with us 6 months ago. She keeps her art supplies in your office and her favorite tea in our kitchen cabinet. She knows all my teachers' names and comes to my school concerts. She learned how to make your mum's chocolate chip cookie recipe so I could have them on special occasions." Emma paused for dramatic effect, a skill she'd inherited from her late mother. "Also last week, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her on the phone with Janet talking about how much she loves us and how she hopes we stay together forever. So unless you're planning to ask her to do something really weird, she's going to say yes." The logic was unassailable, delivered with 8-year-old confidence that made James's anxiety feel slightly ridiculous. "When did you become so wise about relationships?" "I was born wise about love," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "Mummy taught me that before she went to heaven, and Sarah reminds me every day." At exactly 7:15 p.m. Sarah pushed through the restaurant doors, her long blonde hair catching the light in a way that still made James's breath catch. She wore the blue dress he'd bought her for her birthday, and her face carried the soft happiness that had become her default expression since moving in with them, the look of someone who'd found home in an unexpected place. Emma immediately began signing. "She's here. She's here," with enthusiasm that drew smiles from nearby diners. Sarah approached their table with the easy confidence of someone returning to a place of significance, her eyes moving between James's nervous expression and Emma's barely contained excitement. She slid into the booth across from them, immediately noticing the formal atmosphere James had created with flowers and candles. "This is very fancy for a Tuesday night anniversary dinner," Sarah observed, her hands moving in the fluid bilingualism that had become their family's natural communication style. "Emma helped plan it," James replied, which was technically true, though it didn't explain the white roses Sarah's favorites or the way his hands were trembling as he reached for his water glass. "I helped a lot," Emma confirmed, then launched into the rapid sign language chatter she used when excited. "I picked the flowers, and I helped Daddy practice what he wants to say. And I know a secret, but I can't tell you yet, but you're going to be really happy." Sarah laughed, the bright, unguarded sound that had first caught James's attention a year ago. "I love secrets. Should I be worried about this one?" "You should be excited," Emma declared, then made an exaggerated zipping motion across her lips before signing sealed tight for emphasis. As they ordered dinner, the same meals they'd chosen that first night. A tradition that had developed unconsciously, Sarah chatted about her day at work, where she'd been promoted to lead the accessibility consulting division for her design firm. James responded appropriately, but his attention kept drifting to the small, velvet box in his jacket pocket and the speech he'd memorized and practiced with Emma's help. James, Sarah said during a pause in conversation, her eyes studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read micro-expressions. "You seem nervous tonight. More nervous than usual. Is everything okay?" Emma made a small squeaking sound that she quickly covered with a cough. "Everything's perfect," James replied. Then corrected himself. "Actually, everything's about to be perfect." "I hope?" He stood up from the booth, his movements drawing the attention of nearby diners, who seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Sarah's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn, her hands flying to her mouth in the universal gesture of shocked realization. James knelt beside their table, pulling out the ring box with hands that were surprisingly steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant band with a diamond that caught the candlelight. Sarah Mitchell James began his voice clear and strong as he spoke the words he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. "A year ago, I was a man who'd convinced himself that his story was finished, that love was something that happened once in a lifetime, and I'd already used up my chance." Sarah's eyes were already shining with tears, her hands pressed against her mouth as she watched him find the words that would reshape their future. "You taught me that love doesn't work that way, that hearts don't become smaller when they break, they become bigger with more room for unexpected joy. You've loved Emma like she was born to be yours. You've helped me remember that I'm more than just a single parent going through the motions of survival." James paused, his own eyes growing misty, as he looked at this woman who'd transformed their lives simply by being brave enough to show up authentically. "You've shown me that families aren't built by accident or tradition, they're built by choice, by showing up, by loving each other exactly as we are. And I choose you, Sarah. Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you." Emma could no longer contain herself. She scooted to the edge of the booth, her small hands moving in excited sign language. Ask her. Ask her." James laughed through his tears, then looked directly at Sarah as he spoke the words that would change everything. "Sarah, will you marry me? Will you let Emma and me be your family officially? Will you choose us the way we choose you?" The restaurant had gone completely silent, every diner and staff member focused on their table, with the kind of attention reserved for moments of pure human significance. Sarah's hands moved away from her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as she signed her answer with movements that were shaky but certain. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." She spoke the words aloud simultaneously, her voice carrying across the restaurant and triggering spontaneous applause from every table. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I choose you. Yes, I choose us." James slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into a kiss that tasted like tears and joy and the promise of shared tomorrows. Emma launched herself at both of them, creating a tangle of arms and laughter and sign language that told every observer that this wasn't just a couple getting engaged. This was a family celebrating its own completion. "I love you both so much," Sarah signed and spoke through happy tears. "I love this life we've built together. I love that Emma will officially be my daughter. I love that we're choosing each other every single day. I love you too, Emma," declared, hugging Sarah tight. "And now I can call you my almost mom until the wedding, and then I can call you my real mom. You can call me whatever feels right to you," Sarah replied, kneeling to Emma's level for this important conversation. "But I want you to know that I already think of myself as your mom in every way that matters." As the restaurant gradually returned to its own rhythm, and the three of them settled back into their booth to finish their celebration dinner, James felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd learned that second chances were real, that love could be found in the most unexpected circumstances, and that families built on choice and acceptance were often stronger than those built on biology alone. The ring sparkled on Sarah's finger as she signed stories to Emma about their future together, about wedding planning and honeymoons, and the 1,000 small adventures that make up a shared life. And James realized that Catherine had been right about everything, especially her belief that love multiplied rather than divided, that opening your heart to new possibilities didn't diminish what came before. 1 year ago, he'd thought his story was ending. Tonight, surrounded by the laughter of his daughter and the love of his future wife, he understood that it had really just begun. 6 months later, on a perfect May morning, with the kind of golden sunlight that seemed designed for significant occasions, Morrison Marketing's employee parking lot had been transformed into something magical. White chairs arranged in neat rows faced a simple arch, decorated with the white roses Sarah loved, and the purple flowers that Emma had insisted would make everything more celebratory. The setting was intentionally modest. Neither James nor Sarah wanted elaborate fanfare, just the people who mattered most sharing the moment when their chosen family became official. But even this simple ceremony carried weight that brought tears to eyes before the bride had even appeared. Emma stood at the front of the makeshift aisle in her role as junior maid of honor, wearing a purple dress with actual sparkles and clutching the rings with the gravity of someone entrusted with the most important job in the world. Her sign language interpretation of the morning's events for the deaf community members Sarah had invited was simultaneously adorable and surprisingly sophisticated. "The flowers smell really good," she signed to Mrs. Chen, Sarah's elderly neighbor, who'd become a surrogate grandmother figure. And Daddy cried when he was getting dressed this morning, but they were happy tears. James stood beside Pastor Williams from the community church, his navy blue suit the same color he'd worn to their first date. His hands moved restlessly, not with anxiety this time, but with anticipation so pure it couldn't be contained. The small gathering reflected the life they'd built together over 18 months. Sarah's colleagues from the design firm sat next to James's co-workers, including Ryan Matthews, who'd asked permission to attend as a gesture of respect and redemption. Janet beamed from the front row, taking full credit for the match she'd inadvertently created. Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, who'd watched Emma countless times, dabbed at her eyes with the tissue she'd come prepared to need. The most significant guests, however, were the members of the deaf community that Sarah had introduced James to over the past year. Their presence transformed the ceremony into something beautifully bilingual, with conversations flowing seamlessly between spoken English and ASL, creating the inclusive environment that both James and Sarah had envisioned for their wedding day. At exactly 11:30 a.m., soft music began playing from the small sound system Emma had helped set up. Sarah appeared at the far end of the aisle, and James felt his breath catch in exactly the way it had that first night at the restaurant. She wore a simple white dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable, her blonde hair adorned with a few of the white roses that had become their signature flower. But what made her radiant wasn't the dress or flowers. It was the expression of absolute joy on her face, the look of someone who'd found home and was celebrating it with everyone she loved. Sarah walked down the aisle, unescorted her choice, reflecting her independence, and the fact that no one was giving her away. She was choosing to join this family of her own free will. As she approached James, her eyes never left his face, and both of them were smiling through tears before Pastor Williams could begin the ceremony. Dearly beloved Pastor Williams signed as he spoke his own ASL skills, having improved dramatically since agreeing to officiate this particular wedding. "We are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the union of James, Sarah, and Emma as they formalize the family they have already become through love choice and daily commitment to each other." The ceremony that followed was unlike any traditional wedding. When it came time for vows, all three family members spoke. James went first, his hands moving through signs as he spoke words that had been written from the heart rather than borrowed from tradition. Sarah, 18 months ago, I was a man convinced that love was something that happened once if you were lucky. You taught me that love is something that happens every day when you choose to open your heart to unexpected possibilities. His voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. You've loved Emma as if she were born to be yours. You've taught us both that differences don't divide families. They strengthen them by bringing new perspectives and deeper understanding. You've shown me that broken things can be rebuilt into something even more beautiful than before. He paused, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. I promise to choose you every day, to honor your experiences and perspectives, to be your partner in building a life that celebrates everything we are individually and together. To love you not despite your differences, but because of the complete, amazing person those differences help make you. Sarah's vows were delivered in sign language first, then spoken aloud, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd learned not to take love for granted. James, you were the first person to see me exactly as I am, and decide that was exactly who you wanted to know better. You've never treated my deafness as something to overcome or accommodate. You've simply made room for it as part of who I am. She turned to include Emma in her promises. Emma, you've taught me that love doesn't require biology. You've made me a mother through choice and daily affection. You've shown me that families are built by people who decide to care for each other unconditionally. Looking back at James, she continued, I promise to choose both of you every day, to honor Catherine's memory by loving you both with everything I have, to help Emma grow into the remarkable woman she's already becoming, and to show up authentically in this family we've built together. Then it was Emma's turn, and she stepped forward with 8-year-old solemnity to deliver the vows she'd written herself. I promise to keep learning sign language so Sarah never feels left out of conversations. Emma began, her small voice carrying clearly across the gathering. I promise to help Daddy when he forgets where we keep things because Sarah organized our house better. I promise to love both of you even when you're embarrassing, which is probably going to happen a lot. The crowd laughed softly at 8-year-old honesty. And I promised to remember that Mommy would be happy we found Sarah, and that having Sarah doesn't mean loving Mommy less, it means our family got bigger, and our hearts got bigger too. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as Pastor Williams continued with the traditional elements modified for their unique circumstances. Do you, James, take Sarah to be your wife, and do you, Sarah, take James to be your husband, and do you both commit to raising Emma together as equal partners in her love and guidance? We do, they answered in unison. James speaking while Sarah signed. Do you, Emma, accept Sarah as your mother and commit to this family? You're creating together, I do, Emma declared with enthusiasm that made everyone smile. Then, by the power vested in me, and in the presence of this community that loves and supports you, I now pronounce you a family. James, you may kiss your bride. Emma, you may hug your new mum. The kiss that followed was tender and joyful, witnessed by friends who'd watched this love story unfold from its unlikely beginning. Emma's hug with Sarah was fierce and complete, the embrace of a child who'd finally found the missing piece of her family puzzle. As the small reception continued in the parking lot tables of potluck dishes, Emma's carefully planned playlist and conversations flowing between deaf and hearing guests with natural bilingual ease, James found himself standing slightly apart, watching his daughter teach sign language to anyone interested, while his wife moved through the crowd with confident grace. Ryan Matthews approached his expression, carrying the humility that had characterized all his interactions since the previous year's revelation. James Ryan said quietly, "Thank you for including me today. After what we did, what I didn't expect forgiveness, much less an invitation to your wedding. Everyone deserves the chance to grow and change, James replied, watching Sarah laugh with a group of his coworkers who were learning to sign congratulations. You've put in the work to understand the harm you caused and to become better. That matters. She's incredible, Ryan observed, following James's gaze to Sarah. You can see why Emma adores her. She treats everyone like they matter, like their perspectives add value to the conversation. She's taught us all about seeing people completely. James agreed, about the difference between including someone and truly welcoming them. As the afternoon wound down and guests began to leave, with hugs and promises to visit soon, the three new family members stood together in the empty parking lot, still in their wedding clothes, surrounded by the detritus of celebration. So Sarah signed with a mischievous smile. What do married people do next? Ice cream, Emma announced decisively. Married people definitely get ice cream. It's tradition? Is that tradition? James asked with amusement. It is now, Emma declared. We're making new traditions because we're a new family. As they walked toward their car, James's hand in Sarah's, Emma skipping ahead, practicing the signs for vanilla and chocolate chip. James felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd learned that love stories don't always follow expected patterns, that families can be built through choice and commitment, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just the beginning of something even better. 2 years after their wedding, the home that had once been James's modest sanctuary for himself and Emma had transformed into something entirely different, a true family headquarters that reflected 3 distinct personalities woven together into one harmonious life. The Sunday morning breakfast routine had evolved into a carefully choreographed dance of languages and preferences. James worked at the stove, making pancakes that were finally, after years of practice, perfectly round and evenly browned. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, responding to weekend emails from clients whose accessibility projects couldn't wait until Monday. Emma moved between them, setting places and providing running commentary in the trilingual mixture of English ASL and her own invented family signs that had developed over 2 years of daily communication. The Johnson website project is finally launching next week. Sarah signed to James while simultaneously speaking for Emma's benefit. They've implemented every accessibility feature we recommended, plus a few extras they thought of themselves. That's the hotel chain, James asked, flipping pancakes with the expertise he'd finally developed after countless attempts. The one with properties in 12 states, Sarah confirmed. By the end of the year, thousands of travelers with disabilities will have better access to accommodations because one company decided to do the right thing. Emma looked up from her careful arrangement of silverware. Is that because of the work you do? Mom? The word mom still made Sarah's heart flutter with joy, even after 2 years of hearing it daily. Emma had transitioned to calling her that naturally, without ceremony or formal announcement. One day it was Sarah, the next, it was Mom, as if the title had simply settled into its rightful place. It's because lots of people work together to make the world more accessible. Sarah explained. I just help companies understand how to include everyone from the beginning instead of trying to fix problems later. Like how Dad's office changed their meetings to make sure deaf employees could participate. Emma asked, demonstrating the family's habit of connecting new information to concepts she already understood. Exactly like that, James confirmed, sliding perfectly golden pancakes onto plates. When you think about inclusion from the start, it becomes natural instead of an afterthought. The changes at Morrison Marketing had been gradual but profound. James's promotion to senior director had come with the authority to implement comprehensive accessibility initiatives that went far beyond token gestures. The company now employed 3 deaf marketing specialists, had invested in professional ASL interpretation for all major meetings, and had become a model for other corporations seeking to build truly inclusive workplaces. Speaking of Dad's office, Emma announced with the dramatic flair she'd inherited from both her birth mother and her adoptive one, I have an announcement about my school project. James and Sarah exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that typically preceded Emma's more ambitious plans. "Remember how Mrs. Rodriguez assigned us to present about careers we're interested in?" Emma continued building suspense with 10-year-old expertise. "Volcanology," both parents said simultaneously, then laughed at their perfect coordination. "Not just volcanology," Emma corrected with patience for adults who clearly didn't understand the sophisticated evolution of her career planning. "Accessible volcanology. I want to study how to make volcano research and education available to scientists and students with disabilities." She pulled out her notebook filled with detailed drawings and lists that demonstrated weeks of serious consideration. "Look," Emma continued, opening to a page covered with her careful handwriting. "Volcano observatories could have visual alert systems for deaf researchers. Fieldwork equipment could be designed for scientists who use wheelchairs. Educational materials could include tactile elements for blind students to understand geological formations." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she studied Emma's plans, recognizing her own influence in this evolution of her daughter's dreams. "Emma, this is incredible. You're thinking about making your passion accessible to everyone." "Well, yeah," Emma replied, as if the approach was obvious. "What's the point of discovering amazing things if you can't share them with everyone who wants to learn?" James set down his spatula and knelt beside Emma's chair, overcome by pride in the young woman his daughter was becoming. "Bug, do you know how proud I am of you? Because I'm smart about volcanoes, because you're smart about people." James corrected. "Because you're growing up to be someone who thinks about including everyone, not just people like yourself." "That's what families do," Emma said with matter-of-fact wisdom. "We take care of everyone in our group." Later that afternoon, as they worked together in their garden, a new addition to the house that reflected Sarah's love of growing things and Emma's scientific curiosity about plant biology, James found himself marveling at how completely their lives had integrated. Emma chatted in sign language with Sarah about the difference between annuals and perennials, while simultaneously explaining to James why certain vegetables grew better in specific soil conditions. Their conversation flowed seamlessly between all three communication styles their family had adopted, creating a linguistic environment that was uniquely theirs. "Dad," Emma said, suddenly looking up from the tomato seedlings she was transplanting with scientific precision. "Do you think Mom Catherine would be proud of our family?" The question came without warning, hitting James with the kind of emotional impact that these references to his late wife still carried even after years of healing. "I think," James said carefully, his hands moving into the signs Sarah had taught him for complex emotions, "that Mom Catherine would be amazed and delighted by the family we've become. She loved you so much, and she would love seeing how happy and confident and kind you've grown up to be." "And she'd love Mum Sarah too, right?" Emma pressed. "Because Mum Sarah makes us happy and teaches us new things and takes good care of us." Sarah looked up from her own planting, her face reflecting the careful attention she always paid to conversations about Catherine, honoring the space Emma's first mother held in their family story. "I think she'd be grateful that someone who loves you both so much became part of your family," Sarah added gently. "Good," Emma said with satisfaction. "Because I tell her about Mom, Sarah, sometimes when I talk to her before bed, and I want to make sure she knows we're all really happy together." That evening, as they prepared for the week ahead, Emma's school presentation to practice Sarah's client meetings, to plan James's department reviews, to complete their small house hummed with the comfortable energy of a family that had found its rhythm. "You know what I realized today?" Sarah signed to James as they cleaned up the kitchen together. Emma already upstairs getting ready for bed. "What's that?" 3 years ago I thought my life was over because I'd lost the ability to do the thing I thought defined me. But if I hadn't lost my hearing, I never would have been on that blind date. Never would have met you and Emma. never would have discovered that my real purpose was helping create a more accessible world." James considered this, drying dishes, while Emma's laughter drifted down from the bathroom, where she was apparently having a conversation with her reflection about tomorrow's presentation. Sometimes, he said, the worst things that happen to us clear the way for the best things we never could have imagined. Like cruel colleagues trying to expose your character, accidentally proving how genuine you really are, Sarah teased. Like that, James agreed, pulling her close for the kind of casual domestic kiss that married couples shared over dish towels and tomorrow's plans. 3 years after a setup designed to humiliate had instead revealed authentic love, their family had settled into the kind of ordinary magic that happens when people choose each other daily, love each other unconditionally, and build something beautiful from the unexpected materials life provides. Emma's voice called down from upstairs. "Mom, Dad, can you help me practice my presentation one more time? I want to make sure I get all the signs right when I talk about accessible volcano research." "Coming," they called back in unison, James speaking, Sarah signing both, moving toward the stairs, where their daughter waited with volcanic enthusiasm and plans to change the world, one inclusive discovery at a time. Some love stories begin with grand gestures or perfect timing. This one had begun with cruelty and deception, but had grown into something more beautiful than anyone could have planned, a family built on choice, acceptance, and the daily miracle of people who see each other completely and decide that what they see is exactly what they want to keep. 5 years later, Morrison Marketing had become a national leader in workplace accessibility consulting, with James heading a department that helped corporations across the country build truly inclusive environments. The surveillance video from that first night, once meant for destruction, now served as a powerful training tool for empathy education, with all participants' permission. Ryan Matthews led those training sessions himself, his transformation complete. Their story proved that authentic kindness recognizes no boundaries and that assumptions about character often reveal more about the observer than the observed. Emma, now 13, had founded the ASL Club at her middle school, where hearing students learned sign language while developing deep understanding of deaf culture. Sarah's design firm had expanded nationally, specializing in accessibility consulting for everything from websites to public spaces. Their family embodied the truth that differences strengthen rather than divide. That inclusion enriches everyone. It touches, and that love sees the person first, always. The cruelest intentions had unveiled the most beautiful truths, that families are built through choice and daily commitment, that love multiplies when shared authentically, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives clear the path for joy we never dared imagine. In a world often divided by fear of difference, James, Sarah, and Emma stood as living proof that acceptance creates abundance, that kindness is never wasted, and that the courage to remain open to unexpected possibilities can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities willing to embrace the radical idea that everyone belongs. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel family for more incredible tales that remind us what's possible when we choose kindness over cruelty, love over fear, and hope over despair. Like this video if it reminded you that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin in the most unexpected ways. Share it with someone who needs to remember that authentic love sees past differences to the person beneath, that families are built through choice and commitment, and that second chances are always possible when we're brave enough to remain open to them. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced a moment when someone's unexpected kindness completely changed your perspective? Your story matters, and we love hearing how these tales of hope inspire real connections in your own life. Remember, in a world that often feels divided, stories like James and Sarah's prove that love truly does multiply when we share it authentically. Thank you for being part of our community, where every story lifts the spirit and reminds us that light always finds its way back. Until next time, keep choosing kindness, keep believing in second chances, and keep your hearts open to the beautiful possibilities that await when we see each other exactly as we are.